Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Get Schooled on Public Education podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Baker, and remember, charter schools are public schools. And to further elaborate on that, charter schools are free, public, and open to all. And in today's episode, we will break down some common misconceptions. And here to share his knowledge and expertise, we have David Griffith, the Associate Director of Research at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is focused on promoting educational excellence and equity through research and advocacy. Hi, David. Thank you so much for being here with us today. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thanks so much for having me, Brittany.
Of course, of course. So David's research has been published in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, just to name a few. David, please describe your research over the years at the Fordham Institute and what has drawn you to research and report on charter schools.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. We focus on K-12 education at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. We're a national K-12 education think tank, and so we do research and commentary. And we are really, I would say, focused on excellence for all children. So not settling for good enough, but really pushing kids to be all they can be. And with regard to charters, I would say this is probably the central plank in our platform, such as it is, because personally, I wake up every morning thinking about achievement gaps and how to close them. And there are a lot of things that could close achievement gaps, but very few that actually do. And one of the few things that actually does close achievement gaps, according to the research, is charter schools. And I think even more importantly, the research suggests that they close them at scale. And that's a huge deal if you're a researcher, because so often we see things that seem promising or that work on a very small scale, but that don't work when you try to scale them to an entire state or the entire country. And charters are an exception to that rule.
Well, we really appreciate your dedication over the years, and we're thrilled to have you on our podcast today to help us clear up 4 common misconceptions about charter schools. So let's get started with myth number 1. So myth number 1 would be charter schools are not public schools, which this is false. Charter schools are public schools, just like district schools. David, why do you think that most people still don't know that a charter school is a public school? And do you have any research that speaks on that?
Well, I haven't personally researched that, but I will say that speaking with people, ordinary American citizens, your average American simply doesn't know what a charter school is, and I think there are a couple reasons for that. First, even though it may seem to listeners like charters have been around for a long time, the truth is the movement is relatively recent, right? It's only been around for 25 to 30 years, and so when many Americans went to school, there was no such thing as a charter school. On top of that, although the charter school movement is growing, it still serves a fraction of American students. There are states and cities where it serves 30 to 40% of kids, but nationally it serves about 6 or 7% of kids. And so if you think about it, there are really only a tiny slice of Americans who have direct experience sending their children to charter schools. And, people are only human. They've got a lot of things going on in their lives. Most people can't tell you about the different kinds of airplanes that fly through the sky, right? They can't tell you about the model of the engine or whatever. And so, from the perspective of the typical American, this is something that doesn't necessarily concern them right now. And so I think most people just don't know enough to really have an opinion.
And hopefully after this episode, everyone will be clear that, of course,
Yes.
charter schools are public schools and they're funded by local, state, and federal tax dollars based on enrollment. And that's just like any other public school. And also, there are no special admission requirements. You don't have to do any entrance exams, auditions, or anything like that, essays to get in. So let's dive into myth number 2. So myth number 2 is charter schools drain public school funds. And this is another big myth we combat every day. Public education funding is for public education and charter schools are public schools. In March, David, you wrote a report titled, Think Again, Do Charter Schools Drain Resources from Traditional Public Schools? Why do you think it was important to research on this topic? And what do you think are some of the main reasons people believe the myth that charter schools take away from other public schools?
Well, I think it's a very powerful metaphor. This notion that you're draining something, right? You can picture a half-empty schoolhouse, and all the children have left. All the teachers are teaching to empty classrooms. This, of course, is not the reality, but I think it's a compelling mental image that opponents of charters like to draw on. Beyond that, I think it is just maybe a little bit difficult to disprove this notion, right? So, in some ways, it almost doesn't make sense to say charters are draining public schools because charters are public schools. But there is this notion out there that charters are taking away resources or making it harder for traditional public schools to do their business. And my personal opinion is that there really is not a lot of evidence to support this. And one of the reasons that this is a difficult study, a difficult question to answer, is that we can't really we can never conduct a randomized controlled trial, right? And say, well, this city gets charter schools and this one doesn't, and look, they're both just as well off, right? And I think when you walk into your typical school, whether it be a traditional public school or a charter school, the notion that schools are in trouble is intuitive to a lot of people because no matter what we do, the kids outnumber the adults, right? And the average school is a little bit chaotic. It probably can't fund every program that parents want, and so it's not. I don't think it's difficult for opponents of charters to play on this sense that our schools are underfunded, right? That something is hurting them, and I think that's sort of a difficult notion to fight with evidence.
In your report, you found that districts' total revenues per pupil actually increased in most states as the percentage of local students who enrolled in charter schools rose. What data supports this finding?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would point to is just statute, right? So there are any number of laws on the books in many states that tend to favor districts that lose students. So just as an example, the majority of states have something called the declining enrollment provision. And this just says that if your district sees a decline in enrollment, basically you are given a grace period of a few years, during which time you will not lose any money. And if you think about it, that means there are fewer students and the same amount of money. It means there is more money per student, not less money, but more money per student. And so this is an example of the kind of thing that tends to work in districts' favor that they don't like to talk about. Another example is just the fact that charter schools themselves are underfunded. So, it varies by state, as some listeners may know, but in many places, charter schools don't have full access to local funding. And what that means is when a student leaves a traditional public school, not all of the money leaves with that student. Some of the money stays, and it's the same principle. The district is serving fewer students with slightly more money per student. So again, the point is this notion that there is like less money left for kids who are left behind, it's just simply false in most places. It's a big country. There are thousands of districts. I'm sure you can find one where there's a grain of truth to this charge. But in general, I would say that the effects of charters on traditional public schools are just overstated.
And let's dive into some ways that to make public education stronger as a whole. How can public charter schools and district schools work together to strengthen educational opportunities for students?
Yeah, well, I feel like we could talk about that all day. But I'll just mention a couple of ways, right, that I think charters help the system. One way is that they just give parents choice, right? And so, as every parent knows, every student is different, right? Different students have different needs. We just did a report on English language learners in charter schools in Texas. Think about this from the perspective of a parent, right? An English language learner has very specific needs, right? They are still learning English. That is a challenging need for a student, for an educator in a typical classroom to meet, right?
Right.
He or she may not be well qualified to teach that. And you can imagine a classroom with, say, 2 or 3 of these students and 27 other kids. An English language learner may not be well served in that classroom, full stop, right? It may just not be a realistic thing. And so I believe, and I think many people believe, that there is benefit to letting parents choose where to send their kid, right? If it's not working for whatever reason, it may not be the fault of the adults, but if it's not working, then you can send your kid elsewhere, right? You can vote with your feet. You can find an environment where your kid is being well served. So that's one thing that I think charters offer, and I think traditional public schools can be a part of that conversation to the extent that they also embrace school choice within their district or work with charters. Um, I guess another thing I would say is just that it's always good to have a little bit of competition, right? Um, this is kind of the American way, right? And so whenever there is competition between institutions, between charter schools and traditional public schools, everybody wants to do a little bit better, right? Because nobody wants to lose. And personally, I think that's healthy. I think that is something that we see in a lot of other sectors of American society. I think it's good if our educators are competing to see whose students can do the best, who can get the most kids into college, who can get the most kids a decent job after high school. Why wouldn't we want everyone to be striving to do their best on those grounds? So those are just a couple of the ways we could talk about it all day. But basically, I think it's healthy to give parents choice and to give everyone an opportunity to sort of put their best foot forward.
Agreed. And I think that is just so important, especially when we are focusing on putting students first. It is very important to have the best options available. So the next myth I'm going to talk about happens to also be one of your focus areas, which is accountability.
Yeah.
So myth number 3, charter schools are not held accountable, and that is certainly not the case at all. Based on your research, what have you learned about how charter schools are held accountable?
Yeah, well, so accountability is one of those words that means different things to different people, right? Let's just talk about two types of accountability that charter schools are subject to, that traditional public schools are not necessarily subject to. Uh, the first is we've already discussed. Parents can vote with their feet, right? If they don't like how a school is doing, what it's doing for their kids, they can walk out the door. It's hard to think of a more powerful form of accountability than that, right? And the inverse of that, of course, is that a monopoly is not accountable, right? If you cannot leave, then it is very hard to hold the institution that is responsible for your child accountable for its performance. And so this is a huge difference between charter schools and other types of schools and the traditional public school system. Um, a second form of accountability is accountability from regulators or authorizers, the folks who are responsible for creating a charter school, and then if it's not doing a good job, shutting the school down. This is a very important form of accountability. It looks different in different states. It takes time. It is not an easy process, but I think it's important, right? Because ultimately, our first job is to do right by students, right? And so sometimes that means making difficult decisions like closing a school or replacing staff. This is a form of accountability that all charter schools are subject to, and it has a very, I think, telling effect on the way that adults behave, in the context of holding them accountable.
And accountability, it's an important factor in the charter school model, as you stated, and it helps to ensure that students are receiving a high quality education. Let's get into another myth. Myth number 4, which is our final myth that we'll talk about today. Support for charter schools is dropping, which is not true. Polls show that this is a myth. Last year, the Harris poll surveyed parents and found out that 74% of parents would consider sending their child to a public charter school if one were available in their area. And even those who might not choose a charter school for their child, 84% agree that charter schools should be available to families who would choose them. Also, 3-year enrollment data shows that since the start of the pandemic, enrollment gains in charter schools have held steady. And to move back during the first full year of the pandemic, there was a large increase in charter school enrollment, which was 7%, 240,000 students. Meanwhile, there was a decrease in public district enrollment by 3.5%, resulting in nearly the loss of nearly 1.5 million students. David, why do you think people may not believe that support for public charter school is strong?
Yeah, I think I'm going to take my researcher's hat here and just often just give you my opinion, right? I think there are a couple of things that are going on in America that are having taking their toll on charters, right? I think one thing is just this growing polarization that everyone is aware of, right? The traditional education reform alliance between right and left has largely broken down. I would say states are going their own direction. Red states are going one direction, blue states are going the other direction. And I think charters have always been a reform that has been embraced by the center. And so I think that has taken a toll at a political level. Um, I guess the other thing I would say is that the opposition to charters is extremely intense and organized. And that's because it ultimately is attributable to interest group politics, right? And so interest groups don't, I'm not going to name any names, right? But interest groups don't function the way normal people do. They don't relate to politics the way normal people do. They never give up, right? They will never, take an election off. They are there with their donations and their lobbyists basically every day of the year in between elections. And that's, I think the average person, back to our point at the beginning, is very open to the notion of charters when they have it explained to them, when they understand what a charter school is. But the average person is not sort of staying up late at night thinking of ways to defeat, pro or anti-charter uh, uh, candidates in the next election. That's just not how people are. And so I think the opposition to charters is in some ways more intense than the support, which is a lot of which is kind of theoretical or distractible. So I think that's not a challenge that's unique to the education sector, right? It's something that you see in almost every area of policy, frankly, is how difficult it is to defeat entrenched interests. But I think it's something that can be overcome through education and through continued advocacy. And so, I'm still very hopeful for the future.
Same, me too. And basically the bottom line, charter schools are public schools and they make public education better for all students, despite common myths. And it's back to school season. David, you're a dad of two. What grades are your children in, and what do you look for in a school?
Yeah. So, but just to be clear, my eldest is only 3.
Oh,
So
wow.
we're pretty early in this conversation. Mostly, we
Okay.
just look for something with locks on the doors. Um, but I think we're looking for the same things that all Americans are looking for, right? We're looking for some place that's safe. We're looking for some place that is within reach. We don't have to drive an hour. We are looking for educators who are passionate and engaged, care about the kids, have a little bit of experience, right? Know what they're doing, and we're also looking for a community, right?
Right.
Families that are feel similarly about school that we do, and want to create a community. So we are, like I said, we are very early in this conversation, but those are the things that personally stand out to me.
Yeah. David, how old is your youngest?
She's 15 months, so
Oh,
but
wow. Congratulations.
thank you. If I look a little tired, a little dark under the eyes, that's probably why.
I was going to ask, I was going to say, wow, just two children under 5. I was going to say, are you okay? How are you doing?
I'm hanging in there. It is you can't really know until you've tried it, but it is it's a wonderful time in life and a challenging time. So thank you.
No problem. And just congratulations again to you and your wife. That is
Thank
so precious. Okay, well, in your research, what are some helpful resources parents can use when trying to find a school for their children, or what resources will you be using when you start looking for schools for your children?
Yeah, I think I would start by saying you should really visit a school. I know not everyone has time to visit hundreds of schools, but I actually, as a researcher, I would say that there are a lot of things that you simply can't learn from the data, right? And so you are smart about your kid, right? Your unconscious is working overtime when you're walking around a place and kind of sussing it out. And so I don't think there's any substitute for going someplace and getting a feel for it and then trusting your gut about whether it's a good fit for your kid. In terms of sort of how to narrow down the list so that you can visit a reasonable number of schools, most state Department State Department of Education websites have some good information on that. It'll tell you things like how many kids are achieving on grade level, what the sort of demographic breakdown of the school is, if you care about that. And they often give out grades to schools, which I'm not necessarily a huge fan of, but it can kind of give you a sense of whether the school is stronger or weaker, and so start to help you narrow things down. So there's no single point of information that's going to tell you exactly what you need to know. But I think if you can combine that with sort of your own personal site visits, I think you'll be in good shape.
And that's really great advice. Before the National Alliance, I taught at a charter school, and I remember sometimes during those tours when parents or students may come to your classroom to kind of see and get a feel, and it's just always such just a nice moment to kind of connect. If they do choose to attend your school, to kind of pre-connect with families that you're working with. So I definitely agree. Visiting the school is the way to go. David, thank you so much for joining us today and helping us to learn more about charter schools. I feel like I could just talk to you even longer. I really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brittany. I am very passionate about this subject, so I'm happy to come back.
Oh, absolutely. Once again, we have David Griffith, the Associate Director of Research at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. I'm your host, Brittany Baker, and thank you for listening to the episode of Get Schools on Public Education. And remember, charter schools are free, public, and open to all.
Produced by Heartcast Media.